My beloved son hadn't called in months. For the holidays, just an emoji. On my birthday, silence. And when I reached out first, he replied, "Don't call me. I have my own life." He forgot who paid for his college, who held the mortgage in their name while he was finding himself. He forgot until he needed my signature. But it was too late. I had already signed everything, and the power of attorney was done, but not in his name. In the name of the one who hadn't forgotten. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Marilyn James. I was 71 years old, retired from a long career as a legal assistant in a municipal law office in Savannah, Georgia. I had spent my life in paper, deeds, affidavits, contracts, and court orders. I knew the power of a signature. I knew how lives could be altered, protected, or destroyed by a single line of ink on the right form. People used to come to me with trembling hands and urgent questions. I answered calmly, professionally, with patience and precision. In retirement, I thought those skills would fade into quiet memory. I expected my days to be slower, filled with books and tea and early morning walks by the lake. I didn't expect that the people who once needed my expertise would simply forget I existed, or rather, that my value was measured only by how useful I remained. My son, Brian, was 43 and had grown into the kind of man who made promises with charisma and forgot them just as easily. He was charming in public, dismissive in private. As a child, he had been clever and loud, always wanting the last word. As an adult, he had become more refined, but no less selfish. He had a talent for needing things in ways that sounded like he was doing you a favor. He'd say, "Mom, if you could just sign this real quick, it would really help me get out of a bind." Or, "I'd hate for this opportunity to pass us by." Us. He called only when he needed something, not in crisis. He didn't believe in crisis. He believed in leverage. He called when he needed co-signatures, references, old tax documents, notarized statements, help convincing someone he was more stable than he was. I always answered, at first because I loved him, then because I believed in him, and finally because I couldn't stand the idea of being the mother who said no. The last time he called, it was about a refinancing agreement on the house. Technically, still in my name from years ago, when he hadn't qualified for a loan himself. He had begged me back then to take out the mortgage, promising to transfer it into his name as soon as possible. That was 15 years ago. The payments were his responsibility, but the asset was still mine. Or at least, that's what the paperwork said. I hadn't visited the property in years. He and his wife had turned it into a rental for a while, then moved in again after their second child. He called it his home, but he needed my signature to make it official, to leverage it for a new investment, or maybe a business loan. He was always vague, always just on the edge of something big. When he sent the documents, I opened them slowly. I didn't sign them right away. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and read each page twice. I marked the margins with pencil like I used to do for clients. I flagged contradictions, loopholes, places where he could walk away, and I'd be left holding the bill. Then I signed, not because I agreed, but because I was tired of being the bad guy, tired of being told I didn't understand the modern world. Tired of the silence that followed if I ever said no. He thanked me with a text. Just, got it, the X. No call, no update, no visit. The following month, I didn't hear from him, nor the one after. When my birthday came around, there was no card, no flowers, just a generic Happy B-Day message in a group chat. I replied with a thumbs up. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, I stopped expecting anything. The phone became something I used for weather updates and grocery lists. The mail stopped feeling like a connection and started feeling like obligation. And yet, I didn't feel bitter. What I felt was clarity. For the first time in a long time, I saw my relationship with Brian for what it had become, a pattern of requests and compliance, masked as family. I was a resource, not a person, a name on a deed, a dependable fallback, an emergency contact when convenience failed him. That clarity didn't make me cry. It made me organize. I opened the locked cabinet where I kept my records. I began pulling out folders, birth certificates, property titles, insurance forms. I started making a list of everything that was still in my name, every document that could be used without me realizing it, every place where my trust might become someone else's shortcut. I poured myself another cup of tea, and as I sipped it, I said aloud, not to anyone in particular, "Enough." It wasn't anger, it was conclusion. My life didn't belong to the people who showed up only when they needed things, and my signature didn't either. After I signed those papers, something in me shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden outburst or slammed door. It was quiet, internal, like a final book being closed at the end of a long, unfinished story. The kind you reread over and over hoping the ending would change, but it never did. I stopped answering Brian's messages right away, not out of pettiness, but because I realized how many years I had spent treating his texts like alarms, urgent, demanding, always top priority. I began letting them sit, a day, sometimes two. I responded on my terms, not his. And as I did, I discovered a kind of peace I hadn't known I was missing. In the mornings, I made breakfast slowly. I sat outside on the porch of my small house by the lake with a cup of coffee and a worn blanket over my knees. The silence was complete except for the birds and the occasional wind rustling through the trees. I read books from the stack I'd always said I'd get to someday. I started cooking again, not because anyone expected it, but because I enjoyed the smell of onions sizzling in butter. I lived deliberately, privately, and without apology. My world had become smaller, yes, but it had also become mine. And it was during that quiet season that I began thinking seriously about the future. My future, not his. For years, I had assumed that Brian would take over things when I no longer could, that he would manage the house, the accounts, the responsibilities. But that assumption had been based on a version of him that didn't exist. He was busy, distant, preoccupied with projects I barely understood. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't remember doctor's appointments or inquire about the car or offer to visit when the storm took out part of my fence. He had made it clear, I have my own life now. I believed him, and I started planning accordingly. I pulled out the folder labeled Estate and reviewed its contents. It was a mess. Old versions of my will, outdated beneficiary forms, copies of property deeds I hadn't looked at in years. I spent a weekend sorting through it all. I made a list of what needed updating, and I made appointments, one with my accountant, another with my attorney. I called ahead and asked for a notary to be available. I didn't want to leave anything open to interpretation. Then I called my niece Claire. Claire had always been the quiet one in the family, the one who never demanded anything but always remembered birthdays, who sent handwritten thank you notes and brought her own coffee when she visited so she wouldn't use up mine. She worked in real estate law. We had talked now and then over the years, mostly at holidays. But recently, she had started visiting me more often, not out of obligation, just to sit and chat. When I told her I wanted to discuss some estate planning, she didn't ask questions. She listened. She asked where I felt uncertain, what I wanted protected, and what I feared might be taken for granted. I told her the truth. I didn't want my life to be managed by someone who remembered me only when he needed a signature. She nodded and said, "Then we'll make sure it isn't." With her help, I rewrote my power of attorney. I established a living trust. I reassigned all relevant accounts and property titles into that trust, listing Claire as the trustee. I didn't remove Brian entirely. He was still in my will, but the control, the decision-making power, the signature authority, that no longer belonged to him. I signed everything in ink, carefully, intentionally, in a quiet conference room with neutral carpet and the distant hum of a copier running down the hall. When the notary slid the final page toward me and asked if I was sure, I looked her in the eye and said, "Yes, this is not for him." And I meant it. That night, I didn't sleep with tension in my chest. I didn't check my phone in the dark, waiting for it to buzz. I didn't rehearse conversations or wonder what Brian would think, because it no longer mattered what he thought. He had told me, clearly and repeatedly, that he wanted his life to be separate from mine. I was simply honoring his request. Only now it was legally binding. Once the decision had been made, I moved with precision. There was no point in waiting. Years spent working in a legal office had taught me that procrastination was a luxury few could afford, especially when it came to property, health care, and end-of-life planning. I had seen families fall apart over unsigned forms, estates swallowed by probate, and adult children who suddenly appeared with concern only after the ink had dried on the wrong documents. I didn't want that for myself. I didn't want chaos or confusion. I wanted clarity. I opened every drawer in my small home office and began sorting papers. There were stacks of outdated insurance policies, duplicate tax returns, and faded mortgage statements from decades ago. I shredded what wasn't necessary, filed what was, and made a checklist of everything I still needed to update. It felt less like organizing and more like reclaiming control. With every page I sorted, I felt more like the woman I used to be, the one who handled entire case files with confidence, who knew where every signature belonged and what each clause meant. I started with the property. The lake house was the largest asset in my name, and it had always been assumed, by Brian at least, that it would eventually belong to him. But assumption was no longer a foundation I was willing to build anything on. I dug out the original deed, the updated tax assessments, the maintenance receipts, and the paperwork from the small renovation I had done 2 years earlier when the roof needed patching. I made copies of everything. I created a file labeled Real Property Lakeview and tabbed each section with notes. Then came the accounts: checking, savings, a modest investment portfolio, and a retirement account that still provided enough cushion for me to live comfortably. I made a list of every bank and brokerage, along with account numbers, contact names, and online access details. I called the institutions one by one and updated my beneficiary designations, removing outdated names and confirming Claire as the primary contact in the event of my incapacity. I didn't just trust the systems, I verified them. Healthcare was next. I already had an advance directive on file, but it was old and my listed proxy had passed away years ago. I refiled it, naming Claire instead. I gave her copies of my living will and medical power of attorney, along with a letter I wrote in longhand explaining the kind of care I wanted, or didn't want, if I could no longer speak for myself. I sealed the letter in an envelope and told her to open it only if the time came. Through it all, Claire was steady. She didn't pry. She simply helped where she was needed. She printed forms. She scheduled appointments. She drove me to the notary's office and sat beside me as I signed document after document, each one a reinforcement of my autonomy. One afternoon, as we went over the final trust paperwork, she asked me a question I hadn't prepared for. "Do you want him to know?" She meant Brian. I sat with the question for a long time, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew it too well. Part of me wanted him to understand that I hadn't acted out of bitterness, that I had tried to be patient. that I had waited, hoped, given chances. Another part of me, maybe the wiser part, knew that if he hadn't cared enough to call on my birthday, he wouldn't care now. At least not in the way that mattered. I told her no, not yet. We finished signing the final set of documents that afternoon. The trust was complete. The powers of attorney were in place. The property was secure. Everything was now under legal protection, delegated to Claire with explicit instructions and a backup trustee in the event she couldn't serve. It was ironclad. After she left that evening, I sat on my porch with a blanket across my lap and watched the sun sink behind the trees. The lake caught the last of the light and shimmered like a sheet of polished glass. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of damp pine and wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. For the first time in a long time, I felt insulated, not from pain, but from uncertainty. There would be no more scrambling, no last-minute decisions made in hospitals or courthouses or under the pressure of panic. There would be no more signatures demanded with a deadline attached. Everything I had worked for was now protected, not by chance, not by trust alone, by preparation. And no matter what Brian thought he could claim with a phone call or a forged smile, the documents would say otherwise. I had signed them, not for him, but for me. After everything had been finalized, I expected to feel a kind of closure, a definitive turning of a page. What I felt instead was space, widening, deepening space between myself and Brian, and within that space, silence. Not the peaceful kind that fills a quiet morning, but the hollow sort that follows a question left unanswered. The days passed uneventfully. I returned to my routines, watering the garden, walking along the lake path, cooking meals that could last for 2 days. The air was turning cooler by then, the end of summer giving way to early autumn. The leaves hadn't changed yet, but the light had. It came in lower, more golden, soft around the edges. I sat out on the porch longer in the evenings, wrapped in a shawl, watching the breeze stir the trees and wondering if he would call. He didn't. That in itself wasn't shocking. What struck me was how easy the silence seemed to sit with him, how naturally it fit into the rhythm of our new non-relationship. I checked my phone less and less until finally I left it on the kitchen counter, off for an entire day. The world didn't stop spinning. No emergencies occurred, and no messages from Brian appeared when I turned it back on. I began to think of silence not as absence, but as evidence, a kind of unspoken proof. When someone shows you their priorities over and over, through what they don't do, you start to understand. Not everything needs to be said aloud to be heard. It was around that time I received a call from a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in a while. She mentioned she had seen Brian's car parked outside my old townhouse downtown, the one he had moved into years ago when I helped him get his footing after the divorce. Technically, I still held a portion of the deed. It was part of the legal tangle that had never been cleaned up because he promised he'd refinance and put it solely in his name. He hadn't. The realization hit me not with surprise, but with confirmation. I had almost forgotten that property still had my name on it. I dug through the file cabinet and found the deed. There it was, plain as day, my signature, my portion, my liability, my responsibility for his unfinished promises. A few days later, he finally reached out. A text, simple, efficient. Hey, need your signature on a doc for a house thing. Can I send it over? There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of time past, no mention of anything outside his own need. It read like a customer service request, like I was a clerk he had been assigned. I stared at the screen for a long time before I responded. My hands were steady. My mind was calm. Everything goes through Claire now. She has my full authority. Please contact her. I hit send and put the phone down. The silence that followed was not surprising. It was thick, not hostile, just weighted. I imagined him reading the message, frowning, confused, annoyed. Maybe he tossed his phone onto the couch. Maybe he told himself I was being difficult. But the truth was, I wasn't being anything. I was done being a conduit for convenience. He didn't reply, and in that silence, I felt something give way inside me, not a crack, but a release. For so long, I had waited to be heard, to be appreciated, to be treated like a person, not a process. I had softened my voice, withheld my anger, excused bad behavior as growing pains or stress. I had told myself, he's just busy, or he'll come around. But silence stripped away those stories. It revealed what I hadn't wanted to see. He wasn't coming around, not unless he needed something. And now, needing something wasn't enough. I walked down to the lake that afternoon and stood at the edge of the dock, the breeze tugging gently at my sleeves. The water was still, the sky wide and open. I closed my eyes and listened. Not for a voice, not for a phone, not for a reason to answer, but for the sound of myself in the quiet. It was there, steady, present, unafraid. The silence no longer asked anything of me. It didn't demand, it didn't accuse, it didn't want. It simply was, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't rush to fill it. I let it speak, and I listened. It didn't take long for the silence to evolve into something louder, paperwork. That's how these things usually arrive, not with a bang, not even with a knock at the door, but through envelopes and scans and language so formal it almost disguises its urgency. Claire called me one morning, calm as always, but with a tension just beneath the surface. She told me a request had come through her office from a title company in Atlanta. A sale was in process. Someone, Brian, had submitted preliminary documents to transfer ownership of the downtown townhouse, the one we both still had our names on, the one he had promised years ago to refinance. My name was still listed on the deed, and now he was trying to sell it, without telling me, without my signature, without my knowledge. I shouldn't have been shocked, but a part of me still was. Not because I thought he had changed, but because I had underestimated how deeply entitlement could root itself in someone when left unchecked. He must have assumed it would be simple, that I'd be as passive in absence as I had been in presence, that I would still be a rubber stamp. Claire had already flagged the sale. She'd sent a formal objection to the title company, attaching the living trust documentation, the power of attorney, and a cease and desist on any transaction involving my legal interest in the property without express written consent. It wasn't aggressive, it was precise, ironclad, and suddenly everything ground to a halt. Brian's agent called Claire next. Professional, flustered, clearly caught in the middle. He said there must be some mistake, that the client, my son, had assured him everything was in order. Claire explained that it wasn't, that I had delegated all real estate authority to her, that my name could not be used, my signature could not be assumed, and no deal would proceed without her review and written approval. He said he'd get back to her. Later that day, Brian sent me an email, not a phone call, not a visit, a cold, defensive email written with just enough restraint to appear polite on the surface. He said he was surprised. He said I must have forgotten about the townhouse. He said the deal was important for his family's future. He said I was being difficult. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Claire forwarded me another message that came through shortly after. It was from the buyer's attorney requesting clarification. They had already begun financing discussions. Inspections had been scheduled, and earnest money had been placed into escrow. Now everything was on pause. The buyers were confused, the agent was frustrated, and Brian, I imagined, was furious. He had made a critical miscalculation. He thought the silence meant surrender. He thought my absence meant I wasn't paying attention. He thought my name on the deed was just a formality. But I had spent my life working in law. I knew better than most that formality is what stops people from taking what isn't theirs, that the smallest detail, the signature not given, can bring the largest machine to a halt. And this machine had stopped. In the following days, more emails arrived. His tone changed. The arrogance melted into desperation. He said the buyers were threatening to walk, that this sale would solve a financial bind he hadn't mentioned, that he was counting on this. He never asked why I hadn't agreed. He never acknowledged that he should have. Instead, he blamed obstacles, blamed me, blamed the structure I had put in place to protect myself. But the truth was plain. He had attempted to sell a house that wasn't his, not fully, not legally, not ethically. And now, the system he had once used to his advantage was holding him accountable. Claire handled every response. I didn't interfere. I trusted her. That, too, was something Brian had never learned to understand. What trust actually means. It's not about saying, I got this. It's about proving over and over that you deserve to be counted on. He had failed that test too many times. By the end of the week, the deal collapsed. The buyers pulled out. The agent severed ties. The townhouse remained unsold. And not once did he say, I'm sorry. What he sent instead was another short message. You're making this harder than it has to be. I read it once, then I deleted it. I stood at the sink, staring out the window at the oak trees rustling outside. There was a breeze pushing through the limbs, scattering a few early leaves across the yard. Autumn was on its way, and so was a reckoning he never saw coming. He came unannounced. I was in the garden when I saw the car pull into the driveway. A black SUV, leased or borrowed, cleaner than anything he used to drive. It idled for a moment before the engine cut off. I stood frozen, one gloved hand still buried in the soil near the rosemary bush. I didn't need to see his face to know it was him. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there a minute before, the kind that precedes a storm, even when the sky is clear. I dusted off my hands and walked slowly to the porch. He was already stepping out of the vehicle, his eyes scanning the property like he was trying to measure it with his gaze. He was dressed for negotiation, not family, button-down shirt, stiff posture, that tight-lipped look he always wore when he wanted something and hated having to ask. He greeted me by name, not Mom, just Marilyn. That told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation would go. I let him talk. He started with small phrases, unfinished sentences, vague acknowledgments about the sale falling through. He said things had gotten complicated, that the timing had been off, that there were miscommunications. He didn't mention Claire's name, but I saw her in every syllable. He spoke carefully, as if rehearsed, choosing words that hovered just between civility and accusation. He said he hadn't realized I would be so firm. He said he assumed I'd understand the bigger picture. He said he thought we were on the same page. We never were. Then came the part he really came for. The shift in posture, the lowered voice, the moment he looked away as if embarrassed. He needed another signature, different property, different buyer, another deal on the line. This one, he insisted, was more important, a clean break, a fresh start. I stayed quiet. He filled the silence with more urgency, spoke of financial strain, mentioned the children, hinted at personal struggles I hadn't been invited into for years. His eyes searched my face for softness, for recognition, for anything he could interpret as approval. But I wasn't there to perform my old role, the mother who always bailed him out, the fallback, the yes woman. I asked if he had read the trust documents. He said no. I asked if he understood the legal structure I had put in place. He said he figured it was just temporary. It wasn't. He asked, finally, if it was true, if I had really signed everything over to Claire. I said yes. He didn't get angry, not outwardly. He nodded slowly, pressed his lips together, and took a step back. For a second, I thought he might walk away, but he didn't. He stood there, lingering in the same spot, looking around the porch, the garden, the windows, the place that had always been open to him, and now wasn't. He said he didn't know what to do next. I didn't tell him. That wasn't my job anymore. He left without raising his voice, without slamming the car door, without one final attempt to guilt me into undoing what had been done. But his silence as he backed out of the driveway spoke louder than anything else. He finally understood that something had changed, that the access he once took for granted had been revoked, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I went back to the garden. The sun had moved, casting new shadows across the lawn. The rosemary plant was still waiting to be covered. I knelt down and dug deeper into the earth. My hands moved slowly, steadily, with the same patience I had used to build the life he once took shelter in. But this time, I was planting something for myself, something that wouldn't be uprooted by a knock on the door. In the weeks after he left, the air inside the house grew heavier, but not with grief or tension. It was the kind of stillness that follows a deep breath after holding it too long. Something had shifted, not just in the way he looked at me that day, but in how I now looked at the very idea of him. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't anger. It was detachment, sharpened over years, finally taking shape as clarity. The silence that followed wasn't the usual cold avoidance I had known in the past. It had weight now. It was embarrassed, almost ashamed. He had nothing to say because the pattern had broken. For the first time, I hadn't absorbed the impact. I hadn't folded. I hadn't signed. And so, he had nowhere else to go but into silence. I let him stay there. There were no more emails, no calls, no envelopes with highlighted lines and sticky notes. The vacuum that opened between us was not the painful kind. It was clean, sterile, and I kept it that way on purpose. I no longer reached toward the silence like a mother trying to fix what could not be fixed. I respected it. I let it show me who I had become without him pulling at the edges of my boundaries. I used those weeks to take stock, not of him, but of myself. I started with the closets. I touched everything I owned, asking myself if it had ever truly been mine. So much of what I found, old holiday decorations, broken school projects, college memorabilia, had belonged more to the role I played than to me. The mother, the fixer, the provider, the default emergency contact. I burned some things. I donated others. I didn't cry once. I moved furniture, repainted the hallway, took down the photos that no longer made me feel anything. I bought new bedding that I didn't pick based on anyone else's taste. I rearranged the kitchen drawers so that I could find what I needed without guessing where someone else had left it. I stopped apologizing, to myself most of all, for the space I took up. Claire began stopping by more frequently. Her presence was the opposite of Brian's. She never made me feel like I owed her something. She brought ordinary things, a coffee she thought I might like, leftovers from a recipe she was proud of. She didn't ask questions about the legal mess or about how I felt. She let me exist, and that was the greatest kindness. We started working together more seriously. Her idea for a nonprofit had taken root, and now it was growing. I helped draft checklists for elderly people who had no advocates. I reviewed dozens of sample wills, pointed out clauses that were commonly misused or twisted. We built a simple guidebook that explained how to protect your assets from those who claimed love but acted with entitlement. Every page we worked on felt like another stitch in a wound I hadn't realized was still closing. It gave me something I hadn't had in a long time, purpose without sacrifice. My time mattered again. My knowledge had weight, and this time it wasn't being drained by someone who saw me only as a signature on standby. One Sunday afternoon, I stood in my front yard pulling weeds from the edge of the walkway. Across the street, an elderly couple passed by, walking slowly, their hands clasped together. They smiled. I smiled back. The moment didn't ache. It didn't remind me of what I didn't have. It reminded me that peace wasn't something you inherited. It was something you created. And I had done that here, in this house, on this porch, with these hands. The mail came later that day. Just a gardening catalog, a flyer for a hardware sale, and a handwritten letter from a woman who had attended one of Claire's seminars. She thanked me for my notes, said they helped her catch a financial scheme before it began. I held the letter in my hands for a long time, not because it was sentimental, but because it was evidence, proof that my experience, my exhaustion, my refusal to be used again, it all meant something. I went inside and made tea. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wait for anyone to need anything from me. I opened the catalog and circled a climbing rose I might plant in the spring. Then I sat down at the desk and wrote a sentence in my journal. I was always capable. I just needed the silence to prove it. The rules of my life had been rewritten, not by force, not out of vengeance, but because I had finally decided that the old ones no longer applied. And when no one else was willing to protect what I had built, I learned to do it myself. This time, the rules had my name on them, and they weren't up for negotiation. The letter came on a Thursday, tucked between a gardening catalog and a utility bill. I recognized the envelope before I even reached the porch. Heavy paper, formal seal, the kind of thing designed not to be opened, but to intimidate. It was from a bank I didn't use and a name I barely remembered, but I knew who had sent it. Not personally, of course, but I knew what kind of person thought sending a packet of legal forms without a phone call was a sufficient substitute for a conversation. I didn't open it right away. I laid it on the table beside my cup and finished cleaning the kitchen first. I folded towels. I swept the porch. I fed the birds. I gave myself the space to meet it on my terms. When I finally slid it open, the scent of ink and paper met me like a courtroom memory. Inside were 6 pages of dense, calculated language, the kind I'd spent my life decoding for other people. There it was on the second page, my name, nestled between phrases like joint owner and necessary signatory, as if my existence were just a line item in someone else's spreadsheet. It was an authorization form, neatly typed, requesting permission to finalize a real estate transaction involving a property I hadn't thought about in months, a property still tethered to me by technicality, a property he had once promised to handle. He hadn't, and now, without apology or warning, he needed me again. But this time, something had changed. I made tea. It had become a ritual, my quiet way of reclaiming space when the world pushed too hard. I poured the water slowly, letting the scent of chamomile rise as the steam curled around my face. I sat with the documents for a long time, not reading them again, but simply letting them exist. Letting the weight of assumptions speak, no greeting, no explanation, just expectation. Claire came by later that afternoon. I handed her the envelope without a word. She didn't need me to explain. She read the cover letter, flipped through the forms, and gave me a knowing look that held no pity, just understanding. She placed the papers back down as if setting down something fragile but meaningless. "I'm not signing," I said. The words didn't come from anger. They came from calm, from decision. She nodded. No further discussion. We sat together at the dining table, her laptop open between us. We drafted a response that was sharp and spare. There was no need to justify. only to clarify. The trust structure was intact. The authority delegated. Any attempt to bypass the process would be flagged and rejected. There would be no exceptions, no back doors, no forgotten favors. When the letter was ready, Claire handed it to me. I read it once. Then I reached for a pen and signed my name at the bottom. It was the same name I had used all my life, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like mine again. That signature wasn't permission. It wasn't concession. It wasn't habit. It was a line in the sand, a declaration, a closing of a door that had swung too freely, too often. Claire mailed the letter on her way out. I stood at the window and watched the shadows lengthen across the yard. There was a stillness in the house, but it didn't feel like absence. It felt earned, safe. There were no more footsteps pacing on the edges of my peace. No more waiting for another call that would come only when I was needed. That evening, I pulled out the journal I hadn't touched in years, the one filled with scribbled thoughts and late-night anxieties, the one I used to write in when I needed to feel like someone was listening, even if it was only the paper. I turned through the old entries, some filled with hope, others with sorrow. I left them all there. I didn't rewrite them. I didn't cross them out. They were a record of how far I had come. I flipped to the last page and wrote, "My name is not a transaction. It's a boundary. It's a beginning." I closed the journal and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. That night, I let myself imagine the seasons ahead, not out of fantasy, but out of intention. I pictured the mint in the garden growing wild in spring, the paint I'd chosen for the back bedroom finally going on the walls. I thought about writing again, not just in the journal, but stories, letters, pieces of the life I'd postponed. I imagined teaching someone, maybe a young woman like Claire once was, how to navigate the fine print of her own life before someone else tried to write it for her. I wasn't done. I had a future now, not shaped by who needed me, but by what I chose. And nothing, not a letter, not a plea, not a forgotten obligation, could take that back. The ink on my signature had dried, and this time it was the signature of freedom.